Namaste and good evening, everyone. Namaste, Narad.
Namaste, Alina.
Namaste,
Namaste.
Sraddhalu.
Namaste to everybody.
We are happy to continue Evenings with Sraddhalu. Today, part 16 on the current affairs, and we will be taking up some pending questions. And as usual, you may send your questions beforehand at our email ID integralstudies.in@gmail.com, or you might address your questions during live today. I will be reading Bullish Harvey comment. There's too many old people in your camp. Everything you're talking about is old news.
Okay. So it was not a question, it was a comment which was specifically sent on the email ID for the questions. And I think this comment comes from a wrong understanding of our purpose in this series. Bullish is upset that it's all old news. I would even say that I waited for the situation to stabilize sufficiently before taking up the whole issue of Ukraine for a reason, so that it may become old news, so that we can look back at the past and understand more clearly. Rather than taking up dynamic, superficial appearances of current news as it comes up, of which 99% is lies or pretense or deception, which you cannot understand except with hindsight. Our goal in this series on the current affairs theme is not to be updated with the news. To me, that's pointless. It is to understand the forces which form current affairs. It's not even news. Because what news comes to you is barely a superficial 5% perhaps of what's really happening behind the scenes. And then what you have of the 5% of that, as I said, 99% is mostly lies or deliberately distorted content. To understand what's happening behind the scenes, so that you can read through the news and perceive what are the forces, interests, or directions in which things are moving. And more importantly, what are the driving elements which are currently leading humanity to this point where we are today. Looking back over the last 50 years perhaps, particularly after the Second World War, the dramatic decline in every field of human life, the loss of ideals, idealism, the systematic breakdown of institutions, the breakdown of the economic framework, etc. It's happening everywhere on a scale that seems almost surprising if you see that it's happening in the same way and all along, and quite consistently. You cannot explain that unless you go behind the scenes and look at things the way we have looked at. The second point which I want to highlight also for those who have looked at some of the episodes of the series, I would say please go back right at the beginning to the first few episodes where we gave the background framework of the interests which have been driving a lot of the negative directions, and we have spoken of this as the cabal as well as the satanic agendas, as well as the deep state, which is different from the cabal, which is just interests of things. So all that would set a general background against which, when we go into this kind of detail as we have gone with certain issues, we will appreciate better. So I would simply highlight the objective of the series and bring this into clarity, and it will help us to understand some of the other questions also for today and the responses to them. We can go to the next question.
Kurt, you cannot generalize that in a war always both sides are wrong. If you are attacked, you have the right to defend yourself. If the other side doesn't want to negotiate or to find a common solution, then you are obliged to fight for your right and life. Think of Sri Krishna's teaching of Arjuna in Kurukshetra.
Yes, I'm in complete agreement with Kurt. And one of the things which we saw last time is, for a large part, Russia's entering into Ukraine with a limited engagement, with limited objectives which were clearly declared, was one such. And the context of that we tried to lay in broad strokes last time. The problem, though, what I was trying to highlight is, in the situation of a war, the war itself is a falsehood. It's not about which side is right or wrong. I specifically use these words, the thing itself is a falsehood. And as a result, both sides are wrong because it's a participation in falsehood. But from there, when you look at the circumstances in which have triggered that, if one side makes an attack, the other side defends, then obviously the side which has initiated the attack at first generally would be more wrong than the other. Nevertheless, it's a question of survival between identities, egos, interests, sometimes civilizations. And as we saw in most of the complex circumstances wherever we have touched, even between Israel and Hamas, what matters is the civilizational values which are at stake. And it is that which finally will determine which side would preferably overcome rather than be defeated, irrespective of who started it. So you cannot say the side which starts is wrong, because as in this case, Russia takes the initiative of a partial invasion, but the attacks had already begun in a manner that were not so obvious, by the placement of missiles on the border of Russia, by the creation of the biolabs, by various other repeated attacks and killings of Russian-speaking peoples on the eastern part of Ukraine, etc., which were intended to provoke in any case, or had their own agendas which could not be tolerated beyond a certain point. So Russia took a preemptive entry. On the other hand, Hamas did not take a preemptive, it was an outright hatred in the strike. So the references are not always so superficially obvious about who starts or not, who is taking a war, who is on a defense. Even today you may say Hamas is on the defense, but that still makes them wrong, because the basis of their hatred and enmity is something which is an ideological perversion and a falsehood. So we have to be careful in the vocabulary we use, and I've been from the beginning trying not to take sides saying this is good and that is bad, or these people are right and they are wrong. Rather, I've tried to show the underlying compulsions of each side and their driving motives. And then I may say these motives are superior to the others, perhaps, or civilizational values of one might be higher than another. But as far as I'm aware, I avoided the phrasing of right and wrong. So yes, Kurt, I am in full agreement with you. And so I'm putting this as a corrective of the framework in which I'm trying to address this. Again, the goal, remember, is to try to understand what's behind the scenes, so that at least in consciousness terms, we can be aligned to what is optimally the outcome in consciousness terms. And of that, one broad stroke we can say is all wars are a falsehood and should be stopped. They can't be, because one side, as Kurt points out, does not want to negotiate, does not want to find a common solution, or is driven by pure hatred or some perverse ideology. Then it becomes inevitable. That unfortunately is a representation of the collective consciousness today in large parts of humanity. And again, I won't say everywhere. There are always exceptions, even within each groups, within a conflicting situation. We can go to the next two questions.
Gamma Ray Jen, under this nickname, he writes, one of my objections here, in parentheses, there are more, but it would take pages. What was said here is that Mr. Ranade said there were treaties signed that said that NATO would not expand beyond East Germany. That implies breach of contract. It simply is not true, and Mr. Ranade was apparently not aware of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act. That is because he gets all his information from Russia-oriented news outlets who cleverly left out that little piece of information. This unfortunately plays into the narrative Mr. Ranade is prompting. Second, after watching this, I looked up at the Minsk Agreement of 1991. NATO is not once mentioned in it. Ukraine gave up its massive nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees, along with Belarus and Georgia. It is sometimes difficult to listen. He has no idea how divisive the use of the word leftist is. Paints all Democrats with the same brush. And the second related letter, Hammerstrom. If you think that Russia could have overwhelmed Ukraine, you're wrong. It is pure Russian propaganda. They would have to deplete all their stocks of weaponry except the nuclear, and that would leave them vulnerable. The invasion went so wrong for Russia because of decades of corruption in the army, and Putin's deputies misinformed him out of fear. Only good news was acceptable. They thought that Ukrainians would welcome them with flowers. The tank crews did not even know they were in Ukraine at first and were stunned when they got shot at.
Okay. Actually, in the vocabulary, and they're pretty long comments generally they have posted, and in the vocabulary the two are so similar, I even had the impression it's the same person under two aliases. But Gamari Gem has three observations, and I want to address each of those, some of which overlap with Hammerstrom's observations. First, yes, what Gamari says is that 1991 Minsk agreements, he says NATO is not once mentioned. Probably you're right. I don't know about the details of that. Because the bulk of the Minsk agreements were concerned with the whole eastern Ukrainian, regions, cultural, linguistic regions, which have now become independent republics. And Russia's primary objective in stepping into Ukraine was precisely to invade or protect those areas specifically, which were Russian speaking. And we saw other implications and other interests involved. Yes, so perhaps whether they mention NATO or not, I do not know. But the bigger picture you must understand is before 1991 Minsk agreements, NATO was very much involved in the part of the discussion, and the agreement, a lot of the agreements were based on the assumption and the guarantees provided that NATO would not extend further into the parts which were formerly the USSR. It is on this basis that Gorbachev agreed to the complete dismantling of the USSR. I had actually put a link involving this, regarding this, which is very detailed in its documentation, which is titled as an article, "We Ended the Cold War by Lying to Russia, They Remember." This is written in 2017. The link was posted last time, and I think perhaps you have not seen it, or you're ignoring its implication in the big picture. So yes, maybe technically there is no breach of contract with that Minsk agreement, but there are very other agreements and other understandings which were in written form. How many of those are in contract? Frankly, I am not a specialist in international agreements, and I don't want to waste my life reading those things, which are mostly very superficial and selfish in their objectives. But the point you have missed is, in all these there were certain implicit agreements, irrespective of whether those agreements were there. The moment NATO began an eastwards expansion, the moment NATO began to place missiles on the border of Russia and establish all those biolabs with those very dangerous experiments, and I have told you what those contained, including some of the most dangerous viruses which you would never want to play with. And if the US wanted to do it, it could have done it in the US soil, and they don't need, as I said, it only needs one biolab. You don't need 41 on the border of Russia exactly in Ukraine. So there were many other implications, many other interests, and which I've covered in quite detail last time. You seem to completely ignore those and just focus on one point of whether there was treaty breach. To me, that's not important. The moment you have an obvious aggression, whether it is based on treaty breach or not, there has to be a defensive response of some kind. And if it has gone beyond a certain point, it can even be an anticipatory defensive response. So, yes, perhaps on some technicalities you may be right, but broadly, a lot of your other comments which I have left out don't fit the picture because you're looking at only one side of the story. And Hammerstrung then comments, and you also made this comment, Gamari also made this comment, that it is one-sided because you're only taking Russian references of RT.com. But it's not that I'm putting RT.com because I've only read that. You see, when I put up a few links, my intention was for the data in the links. Always be careful about this. You should never care of the source of the data. You should only be concerned with the quality of the data. So I tried to find the links which would give the information which I wanted to provide in the most comprehensive way. And it so happens, because in this case some of that information is completely censored in the Western media and the mainstream media, that one of the few media points that I found it easily in searching was RT.com. You'll find equally posts on X, Twitter.com, as well as other independent websites which provide the same material. But for me it was easier to find it here. So the question is not whether it was because of a link on RT.com, it's about whether the content is valid. And it is that which we have to look at. And RT.com I put as a link or articles from there because it was convenient for me to post those. If you say that Russian propaganda, then on the other side is a massive Western censorship. From the day the invasion starts, the entire Europe blocks off RT.com. Zelensky arrests within a few weeks all the opposition leaders in Ukraine. And I think it was a legal order that he passed that one could not speak of certain things, which was actually a complete suppression of freedom of speech and even of democratic values, which was completely ignored in the Western media. This should have been headlines, if at all, isn't it? So what I'm trying to show is everywhere, every platform comes with its own agenda. You have to look through agendas and look at data points and facts. And even if the facts are partial or biased, you will get complementing from both sides and then integrate those if you really want to understand what's happening. But to say that just alone this is propaganda and the other is not propaganda is a bit silly. Every news outlet is a propaganda voice today. And none of them can be assumed to be free of bias. There are very few, and I have recommended some of them as being generally free of bias, except when it concerns their own interests, but otherwise broadly when it concerns other neutral elements, you will find the data there very interesting. I'll give an example here. This is way back more than 10 years ago. I had found Al Jazeera at that time, it had just started, to be quite unbiased and neutral. Of course, it will be biased when it comes to Middle Eastern interests, but otherwise for global interests. I had found it good at that time. It's not the same today. And I used to watch that for interesting new information. And it is there that I discovered that there was a Wall Street sit-in which had been going on for 3 months. That people in New York State and generally in the United States had gathered around Wall Street in the US and were doing some kind of what in India would be called a dharna strike, a sit-in, and making a quiet, silent, peaceful public demonstration about several issues, about corruption and the fact that the financial system was corrupt and so on. It had been going on for 3 months. And I see this in Al Jazeera. I immediately sent it to some of my friends who were living in New York City, in Manhattan, a few blocks away from where this was happening. They had no idea it had been happening. The entire US media had censored it, and for 3 full months. And it's only when some kind of police violence began on these people and they fought back and there were struggles that the media took it up and colored it completely against them. Subsequently, they ignored it to a point that it went into winter. These people somehow survived. It went for so many months, and the media was either giving negative publicity or no information at all about what was happening there. This is hardcore misinformation and censorship in the West of its own spaces. Forget any criticism of Russia. So, for you to have the illusion, and both Gamari and Hammerstrung have made this comment that, oh, you are relying only on art. I'm not. And it's all propaganda. Yes, surely, as is everything else, and sometimes as bad on both sides. So, this is... The third point of Gamari, though, is that he says, difficult to listen. You don't you have no idea how divisive the use of the word leftist is. Paints all Democrats with the same brush. I've never used the word Democrats. As far as I'm aware, I've used the word leftists. I'm criticizing the leftists. I've not been criticizing Democrats. I have many friends who are, bulk of my friends in the United States happen to be Democrats. Not all are leftists. Some are highly influenced by leftist ideologies, but very few. I'm not in that circle mostly. The bulk of the people are Democrats who are not leftist in their ideology, but the newspapers that they listen to, that they read, or the television channels they follow, have been hijacked by the leftist woke agenda. And so you find a lot of the Democrats are misinformed about the full picture of what's happening. As far as I'm aware, I have not spoken much about Democrats and Republicans. To me, that distinction is secondary, even irrelevant. If you look at the representatives of these two parties in the United States politics, they both speak with one voice when it comes to wars, when it comes to cabal interests. And so, as far as I'm concerned, it's a uniparty which is ruling the US. And what we need to understand rather is the forces which manipulate the uniparty itself and create an illusion of two sides fighting when they're not at all. They're mostly hand in glove when it comes to common interests. So, when I speak of leftists, I'm criticizing leftists or a woke leftist agenda. And even there, I make a distinction between general leftists who have a, let's say, socialist orientation versus the hard leftists, extreme leftists. So I've very carefully used the word extreme left, extremist Islam or extremist Christianity to distinguish from the rest who perhaps may not entirely align to that. The problem we have to recognize though, the cabal agenda, which is, let's say, satanic, asuric, very strongly aligns with what I've described as this woke extreme leftist agenda. And even it has infiltrated them. Cabal agenda has infiltrated the parties, including the Democrats and Republicans and various religious groups, including the church and various churches, various religious groups. And so, when you think my comment about leftists is painting Democrats, no, it's not even. I'm not even bothered with who's a Democrat or who's not. And so, if you review, my vocabulary is very specific. And if in your mind it has association with Democrats, that's because perhaps that's your way of looking at it. So I'm taking up these questions to clarify my position, but also to help you to separate these different labels. Do not be too concerned, as I said, with source of data. Similarly, do not be concerned with party names or affiliations, because that's also very superficial. Do not be too concerned with the agendas they speak of. Like someone will speak of, I'm concerned with climate. Somebody will say, I'm concerned with economy. Again, that does not matter because both sides are concerned with the economy or with the climate. It's just their understanding of what that means is totally different. So you have to cut through labels and look at the underlying agendas and interests. And then only picture becomes clearer. So Hammerström has this very unusual view that Russia could never have overwhelmed Ukraine because they don't have enough stock of weaponry, and the invasion itself went wrong because of corruption, and Putin is not aware of what's happening actually, and the Ukrainians thought, the Russians thought Ukrainians would welcome them. No, they didn't even go in to try to liberate Ukraine or any such thing. So I don't know where you get this very strange idea. If you just look at the data of the arms industry, weapons production, and the size of the armies, Ukraine is nothing compared to Russia. And I'd explained this very clearly. If Russia had followed the approach the United States has when it invaded, let's say, Iraq or Afghanistan or any other places, and those were invasions. You first bomb all the communications, water, electricity, etc. everywhere, all over the country. Leave the entire space into a complete chaos. And then minimally walk in with people. And even that is avoided largely. So Russia could have easily done that. It had all the necessary weapons, it still has. And you can see even today, the strength of Russian weaponry is far greater. Ukraine is begging constantly, asking for weapons to be shipped, and over the last 2 years, you see how much has come into Ukraine. There's no question of this. So I'm surprised at Hammerstrom's very strange idea, and it largely is justified because you've blocked off all information coming from Russia as propaganda. Be very clear, if that is Russian propaganda, this is Ukrainian propaganda, that is USA propaganda, the other is UK propaganda, and the other is NATO propaganda. Everyone is propaganda. You have to look through, behind, and then only things will make sense. Most important in this whole question, which both of these people have raised, Gamari and Hammerstrom, without going into the details of the whole issue, look at it this way. NATO was created as a bulwark against the expansion of the USSR. From the point USSR shut down, NATO was obsolete. As a military organization, against whom is it? It has no purpose. And the right thing would have been for NATO also to be shut down. And then if you want, you have a federation which is economic, social, cultural, political, etc. And that would have been the way forward for Europe. And in fact, the reality was, because Russia no more posed a threat in terms of invasion, NATO was doing nothing other than running its military basic training programs with completely outdated weapons and machines. Why is it Germany has these tanks which don't work? Because they've never needed them, because there was never a threat of anyone invading. And they're just getting rid of their old stock. So what is NATO about? If you think about it, it has no purpose. But then what happened, and it's important because, again, I'm relating to Gamari Jem's comment about 1997 NATO-Russian Founding Act. It was not done under Putin. It was done under this leader who was at that time a known CIA-controlled puppet. And so there were many agreements which were made under those circumstances which were inimical to long-term Russian interests and had certain biases which basically gave away the former USSR countries to be absorbed into NATO. And yes, if there is certain benefits to aligning with the European Union or other economic benefits, that's a different story. NATO is a military alliance. It's not about European Union. It's not about economics. It's not about culture. As a military alliance, it's defined by its need to aggress over others or defend against others. That is obsolete. And so, just looking at these basic things, you understand the root cause of any aggression or conflict comes from one side now holding to military aggressive frameworks which are no more primarily defensive because there is no one to defend against. Again, I'm giving a broad strokes. I'm sure you will find the nuances of some technicality of an agreement or not. It does not matter. All these agreements are only there to express a certain contextual circumstance. Look at larger intentions behind. And I have a second link which I have put up today, repeating the previous one also about Cold War, but the second one which I have put today is Zelensky admits he never intended to implement Minsk agreements. It's an interesting link. It gives you the whole picture, including Merkel's statement, where she said that Angela Merkel's statement as the ex-German chancellor, she said the 2014 Minsk agreement was an attempt to give time to Ukraine. It also used this time to become stronger and etc. So you'll find a lot of things like this which show that the intention was to deceive, the intention was to build a bulwark against Russia and so on. And which inevitably would lead to some kind of a collision of interests and some kind of reaction, as has happened. But again, I want to also remind you of the bigger picture of the issues I've covered last time, and as well as Russia's restraint in not going all out and taking a huge loss in order to not expand the war beyond Ukraine. And this is important. And because I expect very soon some kind of agreements will be reached and some kind of a peace agreement might also emerge. But I hope that happens sooner rather than later. We can go to the next question.
Maurice is writing a letter, but it was a little bit edited. I would like to comment a little on what you have said about Christianity and missionaries. You are right when you say that Christianity is merely a faith, but Catholics have also quite some bhakti, devotion for Christ, Virgin Mary, and God as a loving Father. The surrender I sometimes feel in my meditation reminds me of how I felt as a child praying in the church. Public devotion, though, is disappearing, but in places of pilgrimage, bhakti can still tangibly be felt. The Bible, as I see it, is in the first place a collection of testimonies of faith, and in that sense also experience-based, but I agree that there is no comparison with the spiritual depths of Hindu scriptures and Dharma. It is really amazing how in India spirituality has developed and is wonderfully preserved during the ages. It is a grace to open to and to embrace this profound wisdom. So far, my inside story about Christian missionaries. I hope it brings also nuance to your dark picture of Christianity. Sincerity is a quality of the soul and can be found in every religion, and every religion can be an expression of Sanatana Dharma. If I can put it in this way, but if Christianity doesn't open up, it will disappear.
Yes. I edited out a portion where Maurice shared his own journey, where for a while he joined a group that wanted to go and become a missionary as a way of serving some higher ideal, and eventually dropped out of it for various reasons. But I want to comment on this dark picture of Christianity. I'm sorry for that highlight. As a highlight, it was put in a certain context where the conversion was a primary agenda and so on, and as well as the fact that not just that it's a belief system, and I would disagree with the use faith, where you say it's merely a faith. No, it's a belief system, not so much faith. But the word is faith is used as a word for belief. And there's a belief which is sometimes not only irrational but extremely harmful. So it was that I was highlighting in terms of what came across as dark picture. Yes, that part is dark. You've highlighted something else which is positive, it's beautiful, the bhakti itself. I agree with that. And your comment, this is very important, that every religion and every religion can be an expression of Sanatana Dharma. Yes. One can put it this way. Whatever religious practice you may take, if it is with a spiritual intent and not merely religious, the content or the spiritual or mystical content of that practice is a part of the Sanatana Dharma. Because Sanatana Dharma, by definition, is universal and eternal. So the content of a religion that is aligned to this universality and the eternal principles and values is a part of the Sanatana Dharma. But the rest of it sometimes can be even contradictory, can be even negative and harmful, or merely obsolete. So this is the point Sri Aurobindo makes, that every religion or every teaching, generally speaking, has a local context of time and space and cultural forms, and the essential truths which are represented partially or more completely. And we need to consciously differentiate between these two. Even in the part which I have criticized as merely belief, this whole story about Adam and Eve and the sin and the whole business of guilt and fear, which is dinned into the followers, which is the dark side, as I pointed out. Even that whole story has actually a deep mystical principle and truth. If you go back to the original vocabulary before it went through multiple translations, the concept aligns perfectly with the yogic concept of soul and nature. So when Eve is made out of Adam's rib, it's even stupid if you think about it in literal terms. What does it mean? It doesn't even make sense. If you go back to the original vocabulary, the word rib is identical to the word will. So Eve emerges out of the will of Adam. And that gives you a first clue, that these represent the relationship of Purusha and Prakriti. And then Prakriti and the fall of Prakriti, along with the fall of the Purusha, is this fall of nature and soul and nature into the lower Prakriti, let's say. And the awakening into the higher nature and the liberation of the soul consciousness is then the paradise in the kingdom of paradise. So you'll find there absolutely no difference in the overall sense of, and even a deep spiritual truth. But when reduced to this very superficial meaning and made literal after a loss of content through a wrong translation, then it becomes ridiculous and even wrong. But then upon that error is built up a whole narrative of guilt and fear. And the church, and especially the Catholic Church, lives on it, thrives on it, uses this fear as a control mechanism to hold a population in its grip. And at that point, that whole approach itself, the ideology, not the religion, the ideology of wanting to control and hold is asuric. And you will recall the mother's comment about this when she saw this young girl going for confession and coming out totally shattered and broken, and this priest that comes out all smug, having as if literally sucked out all her vitality and force with his sense of power and domination and having crushed her. That is what I'm pointing to, and it is inherent to the trust, to the church. So when you're speaking of some of the beautiful things in Catholics' teaching, yes, there is this bhakti, but there is also this, which is an asuric influence. How it has overwhelmed the church, one has to literally go back to the history of the church, and that will link us to Neminen's observation. But we have to understand that while, yes, there are these beautiful things and they have survived, thankfully, because that's the human aspiration and the human soul is growing within this framework. It tries to catch what it can for its nourishment, but also it gets all this other junk, which is oppressive and suffocating. You have to understand the effect of that is to put you in a cage, and a cage which is a mental cage, and a vital cage also to some extent. And even if it has painted gold, it's a beautiful cage, it's still a cage. And there has to be a point where it breaks out. I've found this a problem. A lot of people in the West that I have met who call themselves recovering Catholics because of the damage which they're trying to undo. But still the problem is the framework has so tightly formed that they cannot think that it's possible to be free of it. They do not even know what it's like to be free of it, to be completely out of a cage. And this you see, for example, in what is broadly called the Hindu tradition. A Hindu today has never read a Hindu book. He goes to not one temple but could go to many temples. Could move from one group to another and even go to a Catholic church teaching if he found within that a spiritual inspiration, and then go tomorrow to a completely different space and if he felt the nourishment, without feeling bound to any religious tradition, system or group think. And that kind of freedom you will find people find difficult, having gone through the church teaching, to get free from and be in this kind of freedom. They cannot even think it's possible. And it's almost as if a large group, and this is sad, have to break out of the religious mold, go completely into an irreligious framework, and then through a reasoning process recover something which is wider and freer, where now at least they can absorb the truth that they need. I've actually met one person who came in a public program, and then she came up to me and said, I'm looking for some creed. I need a creed to follow. What should I follow? I said, why do you need a groupthink creed? Why can't you just follow what is obvious to you as a freer, larger, more complete truth. And it was too much, and she needed something which was a smaller box. So yes, this also happens. So sorry for the dark picture, but I think it is important that we speak of it. And you're right that if Christianity does not open up, and particularly this dark content is not washed out, then unfortunately it will cause more harm than good. Nevertheless, those who have a conscious aspiration will grow through it and inevitably use it perhaps as a stepping stone to something deeper and higher. Also about this comment about spiritual depth of Hindu scripture and Bible, I wanted to make a highlight there. I mentioned this last in that discussion, but I wanted to highlight this. Every Upanishad directly talks about self. Every question it raises, every issue it takes up is about self. In the Bible, you don't even have that concept. It's all about morality and ethics. Why? Because it is derived from the Jewish tradition and the Abrahamic lineage, let's say, which is concerned with morality and ethics as its primary drive. And so you see this then extending into Islam and so on. But the spirituality there is somehow subdued by the fact that there is this so obvious focus on the external form. You do not see the spirituality directly. You see it implicit by service to God or by self-consecration and so on. And so something very precious is almost missed right from the beginning. So when it comes in later, as in the example you have given through the bhakti, etc., it is also treated as a secondary aspect and not seen as the primary thing in the groupthink, in the teaching of the system itself. And these are some of the weaknesses of these systems. This is not the case in what we may describe as a mystical Christianity or a mystical Islam or a mystical Judaism, where that is made the priority first. And the texts are even sometimes either interpreted on a higher level or simply ignored when they don't have any deeper value. And so yes, that would be the way forward for all these religions to rediscover their mystical content and awake or break free from the narrow framework which perhaps was useful for a period of evolution but is no more required. Neminem had something more elaborate about the church. We can take that up.
Neminem here wrote, I came from the Abrahamic tradition in the form of Catholic tradition. I found out about Sri Aurobindo and the Mother more than 30 years ago and still trying to apply. I feel you should deepen your knowledge about the Church, the Bible, and the Gospels if you like to talk about it. First, mixing together evangelical churches with the Catholic Church is like saying that Hinduism is just one religion. To make it short, the evangelical people are one of the Protestant churches, and they may be seen like Buddhist towards the Hinduist. Can you hear me?
Yes, this
okay.
is good.
Okay. The Catholic Church is the last surviving power structure of the Roman Empire and was created by Constantine, handing over the religious political power of the Pontifex Maximus of the Emperor to the newly created Catholic Church. It has almost nothing to do with the real Christianity, and the Gospels, rituals, etc., were manipulated to ensure compliance to the Roman Empire. At that time, all the Gnostic teachings and flowers of the Gnostic teachings were persecuted and put to death. All Gnostic books were destroyed, and it was Christians persecuting pagans and other Christians. The Gnostic teachings went underground and are still. We know this because we have found the Nag Hammadi texts from the early followers of Christ, and they tell a different story, a Gnostic story. What is called the Church is the Catholic Church, and the Joshua Project is an evangelical project, very aggressive, which is targeting mostly the Catholic Church in South America, Europe, and Africa, while it is attacking mainly Hinduism and Muslims in India. As for the Catholic Church, it has been heavily infiltrated by a so-called deep church, and Archbishop Vigano, once state secretary of the Vatican and next to the former Pope Emeritus Benedictus XVI, is openly talking about the coup d'etat that happened in the Vatican and of a deep church, his term, which is driving the Catholic Church to self-destruction. Vigano is a high-level insider of the church and has made several speeches since 2020, deleted by YouTube, talking about this cabal and one of the infiltration of Asuric forces in all top levels of the church, including the present Pope and the governments of the world. Evangelical teachings have eliminated totally the Divine Mother. So the picture is this: Catholic Church is in itself in a destruction mode since the power structure has been hacked. The Evangelical Church has no central authority, like the Pope, but is aggressively converting people all over the world with a mysteriously coordinated pattern. What do you think about this? And maybe if Narad has any comments also.
Yes. Yes, I'm in broad agreement with what Neminem has to say about the whole big picture. This is broadly yes, but I would still make certain nuances of correction where Neminem says that mixing evangelical church with Catholic church is like saying Hinduism is just one religion. So first correction, Hinduism is not even a religion. There is no groupthink concept, which is why you can say Hinduism is not one religion but many religions. No, it's not even many religions. It's a framework in which there is an active, self-driven process of finding a higher spiritual truth, in which you're free to align with those who have had experiences and choose or follow them, experiment, explore, build, which naturally forms groups, subgroups, break-off groups, offshoots, none of which is considered wrong or in any way a problem, because it's all like scientists exploring. That's the framework of what is called Hinduism. And the correct term would be Hindu-iti, which is translated literally in Sanskrit as Hindutva, rather than Hinduism, which is as an ism is a belief system. Christianity is not an iti, it is a Christianism as a belief system and a group think. So there's a lot of misuse of the names, and even the concept of what Hinduism is completely wrongly stated in the West, because they have to see things in terms of religion, because that's all they know. And it's either religion or not religion, or it's a confused religion or a cluster of many religions. No, it's not a religion at all. The concept does not exist in the Indian space. So the term we have for describing groups is a pantha, which can be a path, broadly translated. Panthas or communities. But at no point is it a group think. Even if you're following a path, it's seen as a path parallel to other paths, and which one is better aligned or suited for your need, for your nature, for your aspiration currently. So switching from one path to another is also acceptable, because it's a question of whether it's helping you or not. And in the very definition of it, one path does not contradict another. It's just a different starting point with different priorities. So in the vocabulary used, Swadharma, which is my individual dharma and my individual path, in the vocabulary used is the assumption that this being my path, what is your path, which is by definition different. You cannot be following my path, I cannot be following your path. And when there are certain clusters which form, which becomes like a pantha, there's a group formed around certain forms of practice or certain teachers or teachings. It's never seen as contradicted by another. So the concept of religion does not exist. But because there is no such concept, there is no word, the problem was when the religions were transplanted into India, they had to find a word, and unfortunately they used the word dharma. And dharma is not religion. So they will say religious, Christian dharma, Islamic dharma and Hindu dharma. No, it's not. Unfortunately, this is because of the attempt to translate and bring a false equivalence. So when you have in the West this term secularism, secular by definition was separation of religion from the state. Actually, it was separating Catholic Church from the state political power, because the church had become even controlling political power. So that separation was secularism. In India, when they brought in the word, there was no such concept. So secularism became equal respect for all religion. That's how it's understood in popular terms, which is not the case at all. Secularism is specifically removing Catholic Church from political power. Or if you want to generalize it, removing such groupthink systems from political power. But there is no such groupthink system, at least indigenous to India. More seriously now, how do you translate the word secularism? So when you find the term used in Hindi or in Sanskrit, dharma nirapekshata, which literally means not taking sides with a dharma. So being equal to all, not taking one side against another. That is secularism translated. There are two problems with that. First, it's not what secularism is meant when you speak it in the English language. So you're talking of two completely different terms, but putting them as a false equivalence. And second, more serious, not taking sides with dharma. Dharma is intrinsic truth. You're not taking sides with intrinsic truth of things is a complete falsehood, isn't it? So all these problems come up in vocabulary, in terminology, in false equivalences, which lead to a huge confusion. When you look at the Indian space from the Western framework, or when you look at the Western framework from the Indian space, they project their view of things upon the Western. And it took me a while to really get inside the mindset of those things. And one of those things was the point you're making, that there is actually not one church, but if I remember right, a couple of thousand different lineages of Christianity or Christianism, which would be the more correct term, but whatever be the case of the vocabulary. But the point I want to highlight there is, whether it is Protestants or Catholic Church or any of the many other several hundred groups, lineages, and I believe there were some 300 major and a few thousand minor, doesn't matter. Irrespective of those distinctions between them, the common feature there is you are fallen because of the sin of Adam and Eve. Christ is your only way to break free from the sin. And if you do not follow that, you will go into eternal damnation in hell and suffer for eternity for a sin you did not commit, but which you have inherited for reasons which are mysterious. And Christ is the only way. So when you have two different churches, they will fight over the differences which they have, but they will come together on this one point that, oh, Christ is the only way. Some will say Bible, or some will say only Christ. Doesn't matter. Those distinctions are not important. It's the only way becomes the problem now. So by definition, if this is the only way, all those other ways are false and wrong and will lead you to hell. So within the church groups, one side will say, we are right, you are wrong, you will go to hell. The other side says, no, we are right, you will go to hell. But this whole business of going to hell for eternity, for a crime you did not commit, and this being the only way against others, this whole business which you have also mentioned about persecution, Christians persecuting pagans, and so on. All of these are part of the perversion which I am pointing to as dark. And necessarily this has to break. And it may happen by an opening to something mystical. You have spoken of the Gnostic teachings. How much of that is really known today in a living form? And I'm not interested in replicating what they believed then. Perhaps it's relevant, perhaps it's not, perhaps it can never be recovered. The question is, can you recover something which is to you a real spirituality, which is not bound in these very narrow constructions, which does not require a group think, which does not pit you against somebody else or make you forever bound to hell if you don't follow whatever group think or belief. Breaking out of that box is what's needed. And if it comes in a modern Gnosticism of some kind, all the better. because it will be better adapted to the forms. If it can outgrow even, because even the old Gnosticism would have limitations and relevant to that period, perhaps no more today. If it can create its own new forms even, that would be even better. So to me, the evangelical versus Catholic distinction is not important. In India, the Catholic Church has been also just as vicious in various other ways. And just because the evangelicals are more extreme in their methods to convert does not make the Catholic Church less interested in wanting to convert or to control, and eventually, as you see happening in certain parts of the northeast of India, usurp political power through the religious conversion process. So all these are, it's just a difference of methodology or form of extremism. The agenda itself to me is insidious and harmful and has nothing to do with the spirituality of what would be the real meaning of the Christ's teaching or the Christianism as it should have been or maybe, or the mystical or other forms of it. But the point you've raised also about the church being infiltrated, that's important, and I have seen some of the statements of Archbishop Vigano, whom you refer to, and I would highly recommend for people who are interested in understanding this to look at some of his statements. He is naturally not liked at all by the church because he speaks out against some of its perversions, particularly this fact that the church itself has been usurped by what he calls the deep church, and that in the higher levels of the church hierarchy there has been a turn to certain practices which better align to the cabal interests, even and to certain forms of Satanism. And I won't go into this further because I've hinted at it before in some of the earlier discussions on that topic, and I would rather you explore and see for yourself. I think I had made mention there. Unfortunately, those times I was not putting the links of the church Pope's audience hall, which is built in the shape of the head of a snake. And when you're inside it, you actually see the eyes of the snake, and then the mouth of the snake where the Pope sits is this fire coming out from below, and a form which purports to be Christ but actually is quite different. And so a lot of these things are quite disturbing. There is a certain chair where the Pope sits in which there is the upside down cross. And the upside down cross, as you know, is used in what they call the Black Mass. And why does the Pope even do this? And again, you will find a lot of explanations to justify it, but they don't stand scrutiny when you look behind. So what Vigano is speaking against is very important. I hope at some point these things will be reset. But what I want to point to is that it's not something new. There has been an infiltration, as you yourself have pointed out, the church taking the political power from the emperor from the Roman Empire and continuing the Roman Empire objectives in its attempt to, rule the world. But also you will see through the years, through the centuries, some of the popes were involved in certain occult practices and of a very low kind. And then there were some popes who were more mystical. So there has been this struggle of the light and dark within the church hierarchy over the centuries, and it's not something new. What has happened today, and this is the point which is for us of more importance, is across the world, through the political systems, economic systems, banking systems, military controls, and the church and religious centers, there has been this infiltration of what we have referred to as the cabal interests. And since they generally align to Asuric interests and are against human evolution, that is important because suddenly everything is lined up. And what you have now is a hard separation between those who are aligned to the light and those who are aligned to the darkness. And within the church, within the Catholic Church itself, there are those of both sides. And there's a huge struggle going on within. Neminem also makes this, had to edit out some of the portions, also refers to the mother discussing this in the agenda, where she speaks of how she was working through a particular archbishop to try to bring about a change within the inner working of the church. So yes, your final summary is important. The distinctions you make with evangelical teachings, yes, that is also true. But I'm going to, so to say, blur out all the fine distinctions and look at the big picture now. Within the church itself, there is this split. And there are those who represent the light who are fighting for it. And I know individuals in India, for example, who are on the forefront for demanding rights for women and equality and some of the newer thinking, breaking out of some of the old irrelevant components of the church teaching. And they fight within the church system, which is a great thing if they're able, and some of them have been able to bring about a change in the thinking itself at the top level. These are centers of light, powers of light working within the framework. So the question from an evolutionary point of view is this: what cannot change within the framework will eventually break away and the framework itself collapse. What can change within the framework will survive eventually, but again at what cost and through how much suffering needlessly. So we come back to these words of the mother, if only humanity would consent to change. And she's making this as a general statement. All this needless suffering could be avoided. And so I would thank all those who have been shared these comments and these questions because it helps to bring clarity. And I don't want to go too much into the details because that's not our object, but to understand the broad strokes of things. And it helps us to make these nuances of separation also where perhaps others may have misunderstood some of these statements or terms. So we can go to the next question.
Kamal, in the helicopter crash and death of India's first CDS Bipin Rawat, is there energy weapons use from either China or the Cabal, or any light on the incident, please?
Yes. So India went through a very important military shift, that a chief of defense staff was created. And I think this happened also under Modi or under the BJP. Perhaps earlier it was under the BJP that this happened. The reason is important because when India became free from British colonial rule, Nehru at that time was not only a socialist, he was a pacifist, and he had some very impractical ideas, some of them idealistic but extremely impractical. One of which was that since India does not need to invade anybody else, nobody else will invade India. So when the question came of when there was this problem in Kashmir and Pakistan invaded Kashmir, he went, we will ask UN to help, and the United Nations, of course, not understanding that they have their own agendas, which created a problem in Kashmir which wouldn't have existed otherwise. India at that time was offered the position of in the Security Council. Nehru declined it and instead said, let China have it. Something which India has had to regret and suffer for a long time because of. More important, he was asked this question: what happens if India is invaded by someone else? By Pakistan, if nothing else. His comment was, China will defend India. Weird. Today you will say it's so stupid, childish almost. But this kind of thinking made him against the army. He wanted India not to have an army at all. And it was the invasion of Pakistan which forced him to recognize that an army was needed for defense. So he kept the army as weak as possible and he made himself the link point between the armed forces. So the military, the army on the ground, navy and air force, all three were separate heads. They had no right to coordinate among themselves independently. All three had to report to him independently, and he as Prime Minister would then coordinate between them even in times of war. That's not practical. It does not work. As a result, many of our wars were also not so effective, though eventually, fortunately, things worked out. So for the first time, I think it was under the BJP that the decision was taken to create a chief of defense staff who would coordinate between all the aspects of armed forces and then linkage with the civilian side of government for whatever is required. And Bipin Rawat was selected for this purpose. And under him, things had become so well organized, things had changed so dramatically in the whole defense doctrines of India and so on, that he had become a threat to many interests, including particularly, because that seems to be the only one today on the border who has a serious problem with India is China, which wants to make incursions and just take up lands more and more for no reason. It need not have been so. That was another serious mistake Nehru made, that he handed over Tibet to China, rather than recognizing Tibet as an independent country into which China had invaded. And just holding that as a buffer zone would have made things very different. But he handed it over and said, we are not concerned, it's China's problem, what it does with Tibet. So the result is now China is on the border and continuing to come in and take over more and more for reasons which are financial, land and mineral resources, water resources and so on. Finally, it's all self-interest that leads to these conflicts. So Bipin Rawat was so effective, it was a threat, and in the succession sequence was a chaotic passage which was to follow, each one coming for a month or two and things like this. Some of them weak, some of them not so well experienced in circumstances of war and so on. So even when the succession took place after that, they had to bypass a few with their agreement to bring somebody else to have some kind of a long-term strategy and meaning. But when Bipin Rawat died, it was in a helicopter crash which was never understood, which was never explained. It was very mysterious. To this day, they found no acceptable, let's say, clear reason for the crash. And so the question is, was there an energy weapon used? Yes, perhaps we can speculate. It could be, because these things have happened. They are done. But there could also be other possibilities, one of them being hacking. And I've mentioned this before because this was discovered by the United States government, and this happened under Trump 2016-17, where they found that military circuits, computer chips manufactured in China, China was inserting content within them, which allowed for a backdoor entry. So for example, motherboards which were designed for the servers for Apple's computers would come back from China, manufactured exactly as required, and they always go through a check, except there was one component extra sitting, like a capacitor, across two lines. What's this? You would have said it looks like a capacitor, it's marked like a capacitor, or it's just there to suppress spikes. Leave it, ignore it. Except they opened it and found inside a complex computer chip which was designed to spy. It would be activated when certain signals came through. It would get activated and then start sending back data or modifying data as commanded. So actually there had been an infiltration at the level of the computer motherboard in this case, but elsewhere in the computer chips also. So imagine a chip which has billions of transistors, connections. When it comes back from manufacture in China, you need to review and check that it's not been modified in some way. And when they did that, they did find that there were things happening. So under Trump, they even banned certain communication companies, Huawei being one of them, I believe, which was a state-controlled communication company. In India also, fortunately, subsequently, the same thing was followed. Because what they were doing was within the communication circuits and equipment, they were implanting their own spying systems. A mobile cell phone tower components had spying components. So the result was, at any point, the Chinese military could activate one of these and tap into any communication anywhere where Huawei equipment was used. And this was exposed, this was spoken out openly, and of course the mainstream media was largely suppressing this content for reasons which we have to understand were part of who controls them. So it's possible that in the military hardware itself, in the helicopter, in the motherboard of the helicopter, in the communication equipment, we don't know specifics, there could have been a kind of a hack. Anything could be possible. Or it could be simply an occult attack. Because there is no such thing as an accident. All accidents involve some intervention of some kind. Even if you say it was negligence on the pilot's side, a trained pilot going on a routine mission which they have gone through thousands of times, how does he fail so seriously that there is a crash? That does not happen. A helicopter does not just fall suddenly. And there were no signs of any problem. So it's possible there's an occult attack. Incidentally, there's a reference to this even in Sri Aurobindo's writings, but he makes this comment. In the Catholic Church, I believe there are certain of these practices which come from the occult knowledge that's part of the original, let's say, framework which the Catholic Church took over, which was from the Druidic framework. There was already in the Vatican a center of Druidic power, which then combined with the power from the Roman Empire and so on. So they took many elements of the rituals associated, including the occult knowledge. And there is still this thing which is done where they have a ritual by which they put a curse against somebody to kill them. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, I'd seen a news item about how certain Buddhist groups who have this knowledge, they actually do a curse as a practice, and it's publicly known. They'll break 1,000 coconuts to release the full force of the curse and things like that. Yes, these things do happen. There can be an occult intervention of some kind of this type also, to which of course the only protection you have is the purity of your consciousness and your opening to a higher protection, which also can act in the context of the military. And I will share here an example which was shared with me by somebody who was in the Indian military at the time. He was in the signals communication division, and he was the go-between at that time between the mother and the military leaders in India. And this was just before the Bangladesh war, when the mother had actually told Indira Gandhi, when she asked her advice, to go immediately and intervene and free up Bangladesh. And subsequently she said, now free up West Pakistan. And she couldn't do that because of US intervention, and mother said it was a big mistake. India would suffer a lot. But when it came to Bangladesh proper, because of this one person who was a devotee, and by teacher MP Pandit was the go-between as mother's secretary. So he would come to meet the mother, and through him, special blessing packets of the mother were sent to some of the heads of the military. And they said from the point they received the blessing packets, everything changed. All the problems suddenly cleared up. And this man told me this himself. Unfortunately, he didn't allow me to record. So much of my memory has faded of the details, but one thing which he did say was, at some point he got the communication from some eavesdropping of the Pakistan communications that their submarine was heading for Vishakhapatnam, which is on the east coast, or was already there. And when he informed his superiors, they said it's impossible, because they had done all their checks and nothing was found. It was impossible that it could come in undetected. So what did he do? He sent the message to the mother saying there's grave danger because of this information that we have, but nobody is listening to me. As it turned out, a few days later, because of the mother's intervention, the Indian Navy found debris floating in the water just outside the port, the harbor of the Vishakhapatnam naval base. They went to investigate and they found this, I think it was the Ghazi submarine. It had exploded internally and sunk. Had it successfully shot a ship as it was coming out, the entire port would have been blocked and the entire Eastern Fleet would have been blocked. So yes, there are spiritual interventions which do take place, and the nature of the battle is not merely military, is not merely political, is not merely economic. It is equally and is not merely cultural or social. It is equally occult and spiritual. At its origin, it is a spiritual battle, which naturally then ripples down at an occult level, which then ripples down in all the other human affairs. And so it is extremely important for those who are on the forefront of the battle to have a spiritual opening, and through that a spiritual protection. Because there is a lot of occultism also used against world leaders. just as world leaders use occultism in the Cabal, satanic practices, to gain greater power or even to apply that power on the masses to hypnotize them, so too they use it against other leaders. And so you need to have a very strong spiritual, let's say, opening through which the protection can be effective on you. So I've perhaps not answered your question. I've used the question to make a broader picture. What exactly happened, we can speculate, and does not matter. What is important is that it's a battle, and at every step we have to be vigilant. And if perhaps energy weapons were used or some kind of a hacking, this has to be a point for us to become conscious and ensure this cannot happen again. We can go to the next question.
Shall I proceed with Nitin's question, or?
Yes, I think we should. We'll take the last. We'll move to the next question then.
He has two questions.
Just one thing. You can take RPX question about good aliens intervening.
Will good aliens intervene for saving humanity under the nickname RPXXS?
So, because this connects with what we just discussed. Will good aliens intervene? Well, assuming there are bad aliens also, then bad aliens will also intervene. So the question is not resolved by the fact that there are aliens, good or bad. So that's why my view on this is more practical. Yes, I'm sure there are beings from other planets, and we need not call them aliens, who are supporting evolution on the earth. Equally beings who are interested in preventing the evolution, and equally beings who are not concerned. They just look upon human beings as interesting example species to watch, to learn from their experiences, and won't intervene. There is a general principle across the cosmos, at least from those who are aligned to the understanding of spiritual evolution, that you do not interfere with someone's growth path. You can assist, you can support, you can even protect, occasionally in extreme cases intervene to prevent destruction, but always being careful not to interfere, because each species, each type, each temperament, each group consciousness, if you look at a national level or other kinds of groups, needs to follow according to its swadharma, its temperament, its distinctive character, and grow through its mistakes even. And a key element Sri Aurobindo points out in the spiritual evolution is the freedom necessary even to be able to make your own mistakes and learn from your mistakes, without which you cannot have a real free spiritual evolution. So this is a general principle followed by all beings from other planets if they are sufficiently evolved. If they are not, then they are like the other barbarians, but with a higher technology, who then come and do exactly what a barbarian would, try to control, try to take over, in which case those other spiritual beings may also intervene and say, hey, you don't have a right to interfere with this is important, and we will protect. And there may be a struggle between them. I won't call it a war or a battle in the conventional sense, but there will be a struggle between them to prevent interference, whereas the other side may also attempt to subdue, subvert, control, modify in whatever way they can, because that's their nature. And the problem with that is, if human beings align deliberately and say, yes, we want to align with this interest group, then nobody can stop that, because that's a choice made by the human people. And so it brings a level of complexity, and then beyond that it goes into speculation whether and how much this has happened. There are sufficient signs to show this has happened, and I've mentioned this before. And I spoke also briefly about this when we spoke of the Nazi energy and the interests involved there. I will, at the end of this part of our theme of current affairs, also conclude with a positive perspective of the future. And in that we will look at some of the technologies which have also been reverse engineered from crashed saucers, flying saucers, as well as certain relationships built with beings from other planets. And it's an interesting theme in itself, though not too much is known beyond a few superficial details. But coming back to the question, will good aliens intervene? To me, that is irrelevant. because the good aliens can only intervene so much. The bad aliens can engage, of course, much more if that be the case. But it changes nothing of the nature of the battle, only takes it to a wider scope, interplanetary. The solution still will be of a collective change of consciousness. And yes, the intervention will happen if humanity does something so stupid as to destroy itself or destroy the earth. Even according to the value system of certain evolved species, humanity is allowed to destroy itself, but not allowed to destroy the earth. So they would intervene to protect the earth. This message, I think, was conveyed very strongly in one of the science fiction movies. I don't remember the name now. Perhaps it's called The Day the Earth Stood Still. But the idea that the earth is somehow more important even than the human beings, because human beings have a right to destroy themselves, as we have in the past, at least in some local spaces, destroyed ourselves, or through certain local wars, destroyed so much that even there had to be a restart of some kind of civilization itself. In the sinking of Atlantis, we see one such story. But ideally, though, this time it will not be necessary. And ideally, through this crisis, through these difficulties, we might even wake up enough that we will avoid needless suffering. So, there are several comments and questions in the chat box which I will keep for next time, but I think this would be a good point to close with Nitin's question.
If I once again see all the episodes of Current Affairs series, I will know so much about geopolitics, reality, and cabal, and yet I know we live in an infinity of ever-evolving data. So how to act in the world with limited data on an ever-complex and evolving world? How to take a stance in day-to-day life? What's actionable, and attitude and sources to keep ourselves aligned to the path of the new world, the divine will? I request you to dedicate an episode to that, maybe a final one, if ever this topic gets exhausted.
Yes, we will have to exhaust the topic soon. I still have 2 or 3 related themes which I want to cover. And probably in the next 2 or 3 we will finish, maybe 3, we will finish everything. So we will exhaust the topic generally. Of course, we will always touch upon current affairs as needed in the series as it develops, because that was also part of Narad's intention in starting this series. So, but to your question, that with this broad understanding, which is our intention in the way we have looked at all these issues, in a ever-growing complexity of information, how are we to take a position in a practical day-to-day life of what is our action, attitude, and sources that we keep aligned to the new consciousness and aligned to the divine will? This is broadly the question. My purpose in this series was precisely to give you these broad strokes that you will be able to see through the deceptive appearances. Having done that, without going to specifics of details, it should be possible for you generally to see what is leading to a greater evolutionary growth and what leads generally to a decline and a loss, generally speaking, and without necessarily taking sides of good and bad. Remember, everything is about self-interest in human affairs, at least in the superficial part of it. So without saying good or bad, what will be the way forward? And yes, certain sides are perhaps better suited for the evolutionary survival and growth, as the position Sri Aurobindo took with the allies against the Axis powers in the Second World War. As we have also looked at some of the situations largely from this kind of a attempt to understand. So that should not be difficult once you have this big picture. This was the whole point of this series. Subsequently, when it comes to evolving details of information, I would simply say do not get lost by appearance of details. Wait rather for the trends to be sufficiently formed to be able to distinguish where it's going. The mistake we make is to look at the headlines every day, and every second day or third day or fourth day, you have differing perspectives which are confusing. If you looked at what happened during the COVID lockdown, the messaging, which was constantly contradicting itself from multiple sources, all of them official sources. Fauci once said masks are unnecessary, then he says they are necessary, then he says they are essential. And then again in a different context he says yes, but it won't make any difference. And then there's a study that says if you're in a room which is closed with a few people for more than 20 minutes, masks make no difference. And then there are studies which show you masks are actually bad. If you look at all this, it was very confusing. And the result of all the confusion was people simply stopped thinking and said, okay, just tell us what to do. Which was the intention of the confusing messaging. And you'll find this confusing messaging happening a lot of the times. But when you see that happening, you can be sure it's part of the programming framework. To get you so confused that you stop thinking and say, okay, what's the conclusion? Just tell me. And I'll follow that. Do not get lost in details. Look at the broad picture of the trend. And there you will find, often it will be obvious, but you can apply a very basic common sense to see where it's going. And if within that you have a deeper sensitivity which is not emotionally confused by likes and dislikes, then sometimes you will also have a glimpse of what are the forces and interests behind the scenes. So that's all I can offer you as a broad approach. But I think if you do not get lost in day-to-day matters, things do become clear. The most important thing will be to stay aligned on the path of the new consciousness and the divine will, is to build within yourself that discrimination, or the consciousness in which the clarity will grow. And this comes from two sources. One is the increasing influence of the psychic presence within you, which has a kind of an automatic discrimination, which detects when there is a mixture of something with truth. But the problem, of course, is it may detect a lot of mixtures everywhere, but it may still say, yes, but this feels more right, although not totally. Or the higher intuition, which will reveal directly what the thing is, where it's going, and what are the interests behind. And if you have both, that's your best protection and most complete, let's say, understanding. To the extent you can develop either one or both of these, even partially, you will find you will not be deceived by appearances. I've met many people and we've received many emails. I don't always use those emails, which have been very appreciative from people, and many comments which people have found these series very helpful to understand things. And many come with this observation that it confirms what I felt. It confirms my intuition. It confirms what I was thinking but did not have data to confirm, or found myself in opposition to popular media or beliefs. And to me that's always satisfying. It's a sign that there is something deeper within which already sensed something is not okay and the truth is different. And if you can learn to recognize this and then gradually begin to trust it more and more, of course verifying each time until the clarity of the intuition on the psychic and the psychic influence becomes sufficiently stable that there is no more significant mixture. And even there, know that when you get emotionally involved or upset or biased, you will have mixtures, but you will feel it and you will know it. And at that time, you'll just stay quiet and wait. Wait for the disturbance to pass, bring yourself into a depth of clarity and equality, and then allow the deeper knowledge or insight to reveal what's really happening. Even if what it reveals is a general direction, that's good enough. But in terms of actionable content, well, none of us are in these geopolitical situations directly, at least for the bulk of us. What is actionable within your life is what you have to then see in every day. If you understand the direction is to, so to say, possess your mind and reduce us to tools and, slaves to a larger one world government, then you know what you need to do. Build that independence, work to create the independence, assist people also to start thinking for themselves, provoke independent thought, challenge the common beliefs and limited understanding of things in the space that you can, to the extent you can, and maybe you can't, in which case, at least in your immediate space, hold this aspiration and the conviction of the divine victory and align yourself to that. If nothing else, this provides an anchor for the light in the world today. I will give an example of this because it's so revealing. This was narrated to us by one of the old ashramites who was there in the early days of the ashram through the 30s. Of course, the event itself happened during the late 30s when the Second World War had broken out. And there was a group of there was a few people who thought that Hitler was right because he was against the English. And because these were freedom fighters, they thought aligning with that would be good for India because it would free India from the British. This, unfortunately, was also the wrong notion of some of our freedom fighters, including the INA, Indian National Army leader, Subhash Chandra Bose, who aligned with Hitler, and unfortunately that was not the best thing. But that being the case, these two people in the ashram main building, inside the building, were arguing with each other. One was saying Hitler is right and we have to align with Hitler. The other was saying no, we have to align with the other side. And they were arguing in loud voices. And what I was told was, after a while they suddenly felt something and then they looked up. The mother was standing across the entire courtyard on the roof of what was used to be the Umanbai's room, and looking at them with a fierce, intense look. Suddenly they subsided and became quiet. And then she went back in, not a word spoken. As I understand it, it was not to them. She was acting on the force which had influenced or seized and got a hook through people within the atmosphere of the ashram. In those days, the integrity of the spiritual atmosphere was so strong and held consciously strong that even one individual aligned in a different way, unintentionally, could be felt as a disturbance in the vibration, and she knew it. She came and pushed out the force. So these two who were arguing just lost the force of the argument. Suddenly everything becomes quiet. Why are we even arguing? Because the thing which had hooked in as a point of support in the material space had been dissolved or pushed out. And this gives a certain deep understanding of how these things happen. And that's why it's so important. And that's why last time I said so forcefully, every war is a falsehood. And it does not matter even if it was started by bad intention or is now held in defense. The war itself is a falsehood and represents a grade of consciousness which is a falsehood. And yes, of course, it has to be fought sometimes, and as needed it has to be. And you will take sides where necessary if you are involved with that, with the side which represents the best evolutionary outcome for humanity. But that being the case, where you are not directly concerned, to align yourself to the divine will and ask that the divine will may act directly in those circumstances to bring them to their best outcome would be the best attitude you hold. And where possible, to the extent you have specific knowledge and understanding of things, bring that into clarity. Especially during the lockdown, it was extremely important that people speak up against lockdown, against this kind of suppression of human freedom, against the fact that there was censorship on a massive scale of independent thinking. Because if you did not speak up, you allowed that force to take over and crush all future opposition and attempt to find freedom. So what will happen in the next 1 year is a lot of this will happen. There will be sometimes slow creeping movements, sometimes very strong forceful movements attempting to seize and suppress freedom. Small pockets, individuals, collectives, whatever form it takes. And it will be essential for us to speak up for this, even when it's inconvenient, even when we disagree with somebody. The right to be able to speak freely and to engage and discuss is important, because that's the only way we will be able to grow. The moment you suppress the right to speak freely, to discuss freely and openly, you have blocked a certain possibility and the long-term result is complete subjugation of the human freedom. So be clear about this while being inwardly aligned to the divine will. Externally, where required, protect the essentialities, and where necessary, common sense, reason along spiritual lines and principles. Where you don't understand in a conflict which side is right or more right or less right, withhold judgment. Watch, wait for a clearer picture to emerge, not trusting media. Media is not your strength. If you really want to analyze, go deep into both sides and then look at what is evolutionarily more complete or better. And my whole objective in going into the nuances of some of these things, showing you the broad strokes of forces involved, is to help you understand that this is how you have to look at things and analyze and understand. Because there's sometimes so many complex interests, you cannot reduce it to just one thing. But through it all, there is always a direction which is superior for evolutionary purposes. And that's the way we have to align ourselves to, at least in aspiration, intention. And where you do not know, simply ask whatever the divine will is. Let that happen as quickly, as completely as possible. And so we can hold this as our aspiration, all of us together, in concentration together, for the world, and for all the different hot spots, conflict spots, and even, I will say, spots where there is peace, but there is inertia and no progress. That the divine will may act to awaken and grow, that humanity itself may outgrow the need for wars and these kinds of destructive conflicts. Let's hold that as an aspiration together. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you.